Good morning. My name is Valerie Laird. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. All right. We have quite an interesting discussion for you, even though I'm here by myself. I'm hoping that you can chime in. Something that's been on my mind lately is how do we transfer the knowledge of, I guess, more seasoned professionals like myself and some of you, and make sure that the nonprofit arena is in fact preserved. How do we do that with minimum conflict? As you know, when you have people of differing ages, age groups within a workplace, and we tend to look at things a little bit differently, that is a wonderful, wonderful recipe for misunderstanding and for conflict. You know, it's hard enough for two people to be in a room who are like disagreement. But it is really harder. You know, diversity is a good thing, but sometimes the more diversity, the more likely you are to have diverse thought, and more likely you have conflict or very rich discussions. And we're here to talk about one, ways we can minimize that conflict, and two, how do we make sure that, given the current state of affairs, not only with the issues concerning um, different age groups, but issues concerning the fact that so many people are leaving nonprofit, not just because baby boomers are retiring, but for some reason, and we'll go into that more, people are just walking away from the nonprofit arena. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to share my screen and we will get into it. Okay. All right, so as I indicated, we're going to be talking about solving the nonprofit leadership gap. Some of that comes from differences in age. Some of it comes from the fact that people no longer want to lead. Some of it comes from the fact that people are retiring. And some people have just decided, you know, enough is enough. I am going to walk away. So we're going to talk about some of those issues and hopefully share some ways that we can, come together and solve this problem. Now, this screenshot is from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It's an opinion piece by Ibu Patel. He indicated that we have a nonprofit mentoring crisis and it threatens future leadership of the field. He's saying that, people are so afraid of confrontation that they've just basically said, you know what, I give up. I am not going to interact with any younger people. I am not going to stick my neck out, right, and get in trouble. He talked about how back in the day when he first started his professional career, he was mentored. Sometimes the mentoring was um, welcomed, sometimes it wasn't welcomed, but he came of age at a time when older employees felt that they could, you know, reel you in and put you on a straight and narrow. And I was blessed to come of age in that type of environment. He talked about how the fact that some of the best advice he got wasn't necessarily um, invited, but it really helped him. And then he talked about a journalist friend who called him and said that she no longer gives advice to younger journalists. You know, she is sick and tired of fights, in the planning meetings where younger workers are wondering why the older workers who have more experience are getting paid more. Their fights over who has, quote unquote, the right to cover certain issues. And, she's just gotten to a point where she's, keeping her head down, keeping her nose clean, and just doing her job. And she no longer has interaction with younger people, not unless it's specific to a task or, a project, right? If she sees something, she's not necessarily going to say anything because she doesn't want to be in a situation where she is incurring a grievance. I've had that happen to me in my professional life. I've had a friend who that has happened to, a number of people, a number of us of a certain age are experiencing those types of issues. And I think it comes not necessarily because of age difference, although we do have differing ages. That is a factor, but I think the bottom line is how we communicate with one another, right? We need to have a better understanding of one another, our backgrounds, how we communicate, what's important to us. And then we as baby boomers, right, we need to not necessarily assume that we have all the answers. And, we came of age where the workplace was much more structured. You had a lot of people from the military who had structured these organizations, and they passed on those militaristic values to us. And our parents passed on those values to us, the structure, the obedience, do things without question. I didn't get that memo about doing things without question, but I think you understand. We have very different ways of looking at things, and a lot of that is influenced by when we were born. So I got this chart I thought would be really good to share. This is from Mind Tools. What they do is they look at the various generations that might still be in the workplace and give you a sense for, when they were born, what their core values are, what their work ethics are, how they prefer to be communicated with, how they prefer to receive feedback, and some of the stereotypes. All right. So when you look at this chart and you see the differences, you can pretty get a sense for why we might have some conflict in the workplace, right? And these conflicts are really, really important. Why? Because some people have actually they've left the nonprofit sector just because of this, or people who are older refuse to pass on the knowledge. Think about it. Baby boomers only have about 5 more years, at least those of us who are still in the workplace, got about 5 more years before we reach retirement age if we have not yet done so, right? So it's really important that we take stock of this chart, and if we're serious about being able to pass on the knowledge and having it received by younger people, it will behoove us to understand what makes them a little bit different from us. So for us in the baby boomer generation, that's those of us who were born between 1946 and 1964, our core values were optimism, acceptance, workaholism, I'm guilty, and stimulation. Compare that to the millennials. They're more realistic. They have more self-direction. They're more goal focused. They are more purposeful in the way they work. And then you look at Generation Z, they focus on being unique, being authentic, being creative, and making sure that the work they do is shareable. And when I think of shareability, the first thing that comes to my mind is, can we put this on social media in some form or fashion? Whereas baby boomers and folks a little bit older, they're a little less likely to be putting their stuff all out there. All right. Work ethic. The silent generation is disciplined, hard work, and loyal. The baby boomers, came about, during the 50s, 60s, and really shaped a lot of our culture, questioning authority, self centered, and crusading causes, right? Compare that to the Generation Y or the millennials. They're into multitasking, understanding what's next, and they're eager. Generation Z, they're flexible, they're self reliant, And the reason they're self reliant is because they have learned from observation, looking at their parents, that corporate America is not willing to take care of its workers, right? So they've learned, through osmosis that they need to take care of themselves. Personal freedom and personal choices are important. The way baby boomers communicate is one on one telephone. We like to press the flesh, right? Whereas the millennials, they're into text messaging and social media, and then Generation Z, they're into handheld devices. I mean, they are the first generation that was actually brought up on technology. So it's a totally different interaction, amongst them versus the way we grew up, speaking one on one on the telephone and in person and all of that good stuff. Feedback preferences. We baby boomers, we don't care about feedback. We don't like to get it, but we can certainly give it. I'll put it like that. I'll add that. All right. The millennials, they like instantaneous feedback. And usually that feedback, they want that in the form of praise. I've had instances where I've shared feedback that wasn't so positive. They weren't so eager, but I will say that they like feedback early and often. And then for Generation Z, again, they like immediate feedback. They like it in real time and they like bite-sized chunks, right? Whereas, we were brought up as baby boomers, writing these long paragraphs, long reports, and all of that good stuff. The millennials don't necessarily communicate that way. Stereotypes. For the baby boomer generation, we are stereotyped as ambitious, optimistic, and wealthy, whereas Generation Y people are stereotyped as job hoppers. And when I say Generation Y, those are millennials, tech dependent, work to live, and not necessarily live to work like some of us baby boomers can be. And Generation Z, they're constantly connected on their devices. They're easily distracted. They're perceived, again, these are stereotypes, as apathetic and multitaskers. So the onus is on us to understand these stereotypes, understand what has been shown to be true through observation and other studies, and adjust accordingly, right? There's no one size that fits all formula. Everybody is different, every organization is different. All right, so here are a list of 6 things that are recommended, and I got these from Mind Tools. Establish respect, mutual respect. From from my experience, growing up in an authoritarian household, and being in an environment, a work environment that was more established and authoritarian, again, run by people who had military experience, it's usually top down, right? We tell you this is the way it's going to be, and you have to get in where you fit in. If you don't fit in, you're shown the door. If you're the boss, you have to be respected. When I was coming up professionally in the 80s, working in New York on the Wall Street area, again, respect was not necessarily two-way. It wasn't a two-way street. We had to respect those people who were in authority, and if they chose to respect us, so be it, right? So we worked really, really, really hard trying to get the respect of the higher ups. These days, the millennials are not having it, right? It needs to be mutual respect. If you want to get some work out of millennials, you're going to need to play by their rules as well as your rules. So it needs to be rules that are navigated and mutually established, right? we need to be flexible and accommodating. That is, accommodating people who are in sandwich generations, people who are raising children at the same time, taking care of aging parents. We need to also be, I guess, cognizant that other work environments are offering flexibility, and we need to make sure that our organizations are doing the same. We need to fight unconscious bias. So, this bias comes, usually when we think about bias, we think about gender bias, we think about racial bias, but we also have stereotyping and bias as it relates to people within different age groups, right? So, we need to take a step back and look at the individual. Not all people within a certain age group respond the same. There are people in my age group who absolutely abhor, you hear me, abhor technology, and they still do things manually, right? But then there are people in my age group who just love technology, and they keep up with the latest toys, and they could wrap rings around some of the younger people with that. So again, we need to avoid stereotyping. We need, and when we talk about stereotyping too, it's not just as it relates to technology, but also working styles and where people come from. We need to learn from one another. So this would include peer mentoring, and even having mentoring, do reverse mentoring. Have younger people be the mentors to the older generation within the work setting. All right. That's something that could be very, very effective. Those of you who are old enough to remember Jack Welch, he was one of the greatest corporate leaders of our time. He ran GE, and he noticed that as he was aging, he didn't feel comfortable with technology, but he wanted to stay on top of his game, right? So what he did was he learned as much as he could from younger people, and then he insisted that all of his senior managers, over 1,000 senior managers, pair themselves up with younger employees, and that made all the difference in the world, and that helped GE maintain their competitive edge. It helped them to develop the next generation of leaders, and it also helped the current leaders who are a little bit older, right, help them to be more flexible. We also need to, and notice I say we need to adapt our communication style. Our communication style is severely impacted by our surroundings, it's impacted by our age group, because certain rules, the rules change over time, and we're all responding to the rules that were in force, when we were coming up. And we need to focus on similarities rather than differences. And this would apply, not only to age differences, but racial differences, generational differences. So if you're going to get the most out of your people, you know, you need to celebrate the differences, but don't focus on the differences to the point where they become a distraction, right? Take advantage of the differences, because, there is evidence that organizations that are more diverse, and if they capitalize on the diversity, meaning capitalize on getting the most out of every individual, they tend to be more profitable than their peers that are homogeneous. All right. So the same holds true for nonprofits. Another way we can look at this is look at people across personality types. It doesn't necessarily have to be age, right? We can look at our personality types, and these personality types are with us whether we're 20 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old, or 80 years old. We all have common factors, and there are four major categories for the personality types, and we all have some combination of these different types. There is the dominant type, right? And these people tend to rise to the top of most organizations. They have that sheer force, right? They often use force to overcome resistance, right? They tend to be very, very resilient. People tend to naturally follow these people. And then we have the people who are influencers. They're not necessarily the dominant person in the room, but they tend to be able to um, get their way by charming folks, right? People with um, this characteristic as their dominant characteristic, they tend to be lobbyists, they tend to be advocates, right? They tend to be salespeople. They're really good at, and they're very charismatic. They're good at selling ideas and convincing people to go along. And then there is the S, those steady people. They're warm, they're voluntary, they accept others easily, and they fulfill a need to fulfill a request. They feel a need to fulfill a request. And this is part of their makeup, right? They're not necessarily looking for the limelight. You'll find people in the service professions, nurses and doctors, and they tend to also be very detail oriented, tend to be perfectionists. And the same is true for compliance people. Compliance people, and I'm not necessarily talking about the laws, but they do tend to be legalistic in the way they approach things. There are certain structures, there's certain rules that we have to follow, right? And they tend to follow the leader. They tend to fall in line with the status quo. All right, so the next article I wanted to share with you is Unlocking the Benefits of the Multigenerational Workplace. And this is by Ellen Bailey and Kevin Owens, and Kevin with the C. And this is a female. At any rate, this article was from the Harvard Business Review. And they were saying that generational diversity is broader than ever in today's workforce, but organizations that can recognize and leverage the strengths of each generation hold a significant competitive advantage. Again, as I was saying before, those organizations that have figured out a way to manage all of that diversity and get the most out of the diverse groups, they tend to outperform financially other organizations, right? So you really want to take a clue. And I know, from my experience and observation, that our tendency is to hire people that look like us, act like us, have the same core values. And there's some merit to that. Let's be clear. But organizations that are more homogeneous tend to not perform as well as those that are more diverse. The homogeneous people, they tend to work in the echo chamber. They don't welcome ideas from the outside. And in many cases, they're run by older people who are not willing to listen to younger people or even new ideas, even if the ideas come from people who are from the same age group. But Bailey and Owens, they gave us 5 questions that we can all ask ourselves, all right, to make sure that we can get the multi-generational advantage. So the first question or set of questions is, how are generations distributed throughout your organization? So you might want to do a chart, and I believe I shared this chart with you in a couple videos, right? A couple cycles ago, where you list who your people are, right? And then, list their skill sets, what department they're from, list their ages, and that will tell you at a glance. And if you have a more sophisticated department, work with your HR. They should be able to get your report that will give you that information. But you want to be able to see at a glance where the skill sets are, what the age groups are, understand what functions or business units they're in, and then look at where the diversity is. You are more likely to have more misunderstandings where the diversity is. And that's not to say that you don't get more misunderstandings, or you don't get misunderstandings in other groups. But typically, the more diverse your groups are, the more potential you're going to have for misunderstanding. Why? Because people have different backgrounds, they have different approaches, different core values, and it's hard enough when you get two people of like minds together, right? But imagine how much harder it is when people come from various uh, pros- um, perspectives, right? Different points of view. All right, so you want to think about generational issues when you're making hiring decisions, right? And then you think about how many cross-generational pairings do you have on different teams. And this is a time where you can really be intentional, right? How do you pair people up? Our tendency is, the young people are going to work together, the middle-aged people are going to work together, but can we be intentional about breaking up and matching up groups, of people who don't tend to work together, right? And sometimes that could be across age. And then think about some of the challenges you're going to have in advance. And then how can you turn those challenges into opportunities and advantages? All right, so there are three A's: awareness, authenticity, and accountability. What are some of the ways that you can use that to make your environment more welcoming, more inclusive for people of different generations? Younger people, they see us, right? And we see us, but I think younger people can see us more for who we are than we can ourselves, because we have a certain way of doing things as older people. So they're looking for authenticity. It's not do as I say, but do as I do. They're going to ask questions, and you want to create standards that are fair and equitable, and make sure that everybody, regardless of age, regardless of race, regardless of gender, has an equal opportunity to get ahead. And then another question you want to ask is, how do you recognize people who actually do the work and not just do the work, but excel at the work? You know, I had a conversation with my sister who is of a certain age as well. She says, right now everybody gets surprised just for being in the game. How do we keep people motivated, recognize people for being in the game, because there's some accomplishment even in that. But how do you make sure that the people who are being acknowledged for being in the game and not necessarily go any further than that, how do you compare that to acknowledging someone who goes over and beyond the call to duty? I would say that you need to develop an objective set of criteria, right? So it's not just, you're pointing out this person, that person, and then people begin to wonder, well, what's this about, right? Have some objective scoring criteria. Even if you're just a 2 or 3 person shop, right? Make sure that it's objective. Make sure that people are rewarded for their contributions financially, as well as, given greater visibility. In the absence of money, thank you and recognition go a long way. All right, so how do you create high profile opportunities? These could be through live events, it could be through podcasts, webinars, byline articles. How do you make sure that people get their recognition for multi-general partners or teams, to make sure that they can share their expertise with the whole generation? So what would that look like? That might look like a monthly newsletter where you're acknowledging Employee of the Month. It might be a monthly newsletter where you're giving someone an opportunity to have their own little corner, their own little column, right? It might look like recognizing a department for, what they've been able to accomplish. All right. And as you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write them down. And also, I didn't ask before, but if you could leave your name and where you're from and any experience that you've had in the nonprofit, experience that you've had working with different generational groups, and the successes you've had, the challenges you've had. What experience have you had or have you observed where people are leaving the nonprofit industry, right? They're going to the private sector, they're retiring early. What are some things that we can do to make sure that, one, when they leave, there's not a skill vacuum? We're seeing that in the corporate world where older workers are being pushed out in favor of younger people, and there's a brain drain. These organizations are not as um, profitable as they thought they would be once they got the older people out. They're losing their competitive edge. And I really see that in church as well, where there is an intense effort to bring on people who are younger, but that effort, at least the way I see it being played out, it doesn't have to be played out this way, but this is the way I see it being played out. um, the effort bringing in younger people is coming at the expense of retaining the older people who are more likely to give large sums of money, right? So there's got to be a way, and I believe that there are some churches that have mastered it. There's got to be a way where you can retain the older generation as well as the new generation, and they can coexist. It doesn't have to be an either or, but a both and. All right, so this next article I looked at is fewer people want to lead nonprofits. What's the answer? I got this from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and this was written by Francis Kuhnrother and Sean Thomas Brightfield, right? So they found that a new study, or they were reporting on a new study that found that aspiring leaders, especially those of color, aren't being pulled into leadership through support and positive role models, but they're more often pushed into top positions to escape difficult work circumstances. So basically, they see that there's a problem in the environment and they want to change it. They're going into leadership not because they have this warm and fuzzy feeling, but they feel like they need to make change for the whole group. So they're more activists within their organization. And these next few slides, I'm going to share almost verbatim, some of the findings that they found. I thought it was really interesting, to see, or to actually hear their voice as they looked at the data. They said that important strides have been made in the past decade to support new nonprofit leaders. So basically, what we're seeing is, an onslaught of leadership development programs, right? But as more baby boomers are stepping down from top spots, we have fewer people who actually want to step in to take their place. And those who are interested, especially people of color, they're moving into leadership out of dissatisfaction with the way their organizations are run. So, case in point, I know for a fact, I know a woman who is naturally gifted with leadership abilities, but she refuses. She refuses to take on a leadership role, although for all intents and purposes, she's doing it. She's not being paid to do it. She's just a natural leader. And the first thing she says is she doesn't want to be responsible for other people's actions. She knows she's surrounded by a bunch of slackers, and she doesn't want to be responsible for making sure that they do what they're supposed to do. And then there are people of color, if they're in large white run organizations, they see that there's certain policies that may be unintentional but serve to be inequitable to people of color. They focus on doing what they can to move through the ranks, hoping that once they get there, right, they can make a change. The findings of the survey show that the percentage of respondents of color who aspired to lead an organization had dipped to the lowest levels across 3 surveys that they conducted since 2016. So, from a high of 52% in 2019 down to 46%. All right. And that's based on data they had from 22. And they're finding that this is particularly alarming because other surveys in the past showed that people of color were actually stepping up to the plate and they were really aspiring, raring to go. So apparently something happened between 2019 and 2022. Some of it is probably related to COVID-19 when just everything shifted. Our world has fundamentally shifted and it'll never be the same. But, we're starting to come back now, and people are still not very interested in going back into leadership positions. And this is blacks and whites and Latinos as well, but it's more pronounced in the black and brown community. So they go on to say that when we looked at what could be driving this reversal, we found that aspiring leaders, especially those of color, weren't being pulled into leadership through support and positive role models. So they weren't being mentored, right? There weren't people, for the most part, there's exceptions to every rule, so I'm generalizing. But for the most part, when there's mentoring going on in larger organizations, if the leaders pull someone along, it usually was somebody who looked like them, act like them, or whatever. So it's only natural that many people of color would not be the natural person chosen to be mentored. So people who want to change these dynamics, they aspire to leadership, hoping that they can make a change. So they weren't being pulled into leadership through people who wanted to see them succeed and made sure that they remove barriers to their promotion, right? So they had to find other ways and usually had to figure things out for themselves or find support from outside the organization to try to figure out strategies for getting ahead. So they were more often pushed into top positions to escape difficult work circumstances and improve the situation for themselves and others. So there's usually a thought, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this so that my people won't have the same problems that I had, right? So they also found that both people of color and white respondents have reported fewer challenges with issues such as adequate pay, opportunities for advancement, and workloads, and they receive generally greater organizational support for their work. So this is true for people of color. So it wasn't the traditional barriers that were driving them to succeed, right? That would drive them to leadership. So there was an assumption that once you take away those barriers that I just mentioned, that would translate into a more positive desire to move into leadership. However, they found that the data said just the opposite. The more challenges respondents faced in nonprofit workplaces, including inadequate salaries and lack of mentors, the more likely they were to express an interest in the top role, and particularly people of color. So, part of going into leadership, especially if you're mission driven, that becomes part of your mission. If you're anything like me, you tend to try to change the environment rather than fit into the environment. So in some cases, and I don't have the data that goes behind these high level numbers, but I can imagine in some cases people might feel that, okay, once they have aspired to this level of leadership and they've accomplished what they need to accomplish, rather than trying to go to the next rung, they may go to another organization. And just the opposite can be true. once they find that if they're in this position and it's not supportive as they'd hope, then they move on. All right. So, what were the findings? They were saying that this pattern was evident in the higher leadership aspiration rates among staff of color in organizations where 75% of the board and senior leaders are white. So, in organizations that were mostly white, you probably saw black people, at least the people who responded to this. Black people and brown people were more anxious to get in leadership because they saw a need to make a change. People of color in these white run nonprofits were less likely to feel that they had a voice in their organization or that they would be happy still working there in 3 years compared to those working in nonprofits led by people of color. All right. This finding further reinforces the conclusion that nonprofit staff are more often interested in moving into leadership roles to escape problems with their current positions. And they probably find that once they get there, they're disillusioned because in many instances, not all, in many instances, they're not able to affect the change because they don't have the support. All right. So they found that once in the job, executive directors of color continue to report less support from boards and staff. So it's not just their higher ups, but people who are working for them, right? So they compared what was going on with black executive directors in mostly white organizations and the experience of white people in mostly white organizations. So they found that 70% a white executive director said that they had strong support from their board, right, when they entered their position. Compare that to just 49% for leaders of color. And let's not forget the burnout factor. So, leaders in jobs, they reported burnout as their top reason. 41% of executive directors of color compared to 31% of white leaders. Either way it go, black, white, or brown, burnout made a huge difference in terms of whether people wanted to stay, whether they wanted to leave, or whether they just chose not to try to go to that next level in their own organization. So, here are some tips that they provide to make sure that you can make leadership attractive and retain your top leaders. First of all, make sure that the job is doable. You want to make sure that, when we talk about doable, that there's money. Put your money where your mouth is. Make sure that the leaders have the resources that they need to do the job. So that's money, that's people, that's equipment, anything that is necessary in relationships. If you can foster those relationships for your executives, so that they can do their job better, then do so. Make sure too you address concerns about pay equity. So the way you can do that is not only develop a scale, but make sure that you adhere to the scale. There are horror stories about how some smaller organizations create a pay scale and then they still reward they still reward their favorites accordingly, right? So make sure you enforce the scale. You want to also push back on the work itself from local government officials and others, especially for leaders working with communities of color. So sometimes our local government entities or even our private funders might suggest that we go about our work one way, but in those positions we might feel that this is not necessarily best for our mental health, may not be best for our ability to create an impact or whatever. But if you're going to push back, make sure that you can create a win-win situation where both your funder, who might also be the government or a foundation, can live with the outcome as well. And this might become especially important if you work for organizations that are serving communities of color. Why? Because those leaders tend to work in organizations that are under resourced unless they happen to be run by white people who have access to deep pockets. All right. Another strategy is to increase support from exiting leaders and other executive directors. So you want to create a network, right? Network of other executive directors, other senior level people, and be able to bounce ideas from them before the current executive director leaves. Make sure that you have a talk with them, right, to understand why they're leaving, understand some of the pitfalls, and understanding too that they may not tell you everything. Is going to be incumbent on you as a new leader to do your own homework. So, what does that mean? That means talking to the person that left or is leaving, talking to the board, talking to people that would report to you, reading the financial documents, reading the program documents, and trying to assess for yourself what some of the issues are, and then develop a plan, of how you're going to deal with things for the first 100 days. And we do, for our members, we do have a workbook where you can work through your first 100 days, develop a plan of action. Another thing that you might want to do is work with your board and get your board to make introductions um, with you and the funders, because sometimes funders, when they see that an organization is getting a new leader, they take a wait and see attitude. They may have given the organization money for 10 years straight, but once they find out there's a change in leadership, they're like, uh-oh. So make sure you have open and honest conversations with your funders. Let them know that there is a change of leadership. Let them meet the new leadership so that they can assess that this person is A-OK. All right. And another finding is that leaders of color got way less support from their predecessors and leaders in the organization. So again, you want to be able to hit the ground running, establish a rapport with folks. And I would even suggest that you not take a job unless there's commitment from your superiors that they are going to do the things that would help set you up for success. And that includes putting you in touch with funders and making sure you have access to all the resources that you need. All right. They also found that 22% of leaders of color and 30% of white leaders got support from the people that had the job before they had. And 33% of leaders of color and 41% of white leaders got support from leaders in other generations. I'm sorry, in other organizations. So, what this is saying is typically, it doesn't have to be the case, but typically, based on the findings from the survey of the people that they surveyed, right? White people tend to have stronger and broader networks, both within the organization and without the organization, than people of color, right? So the onus is going to have to be on leaders of color. Do what you can to increase and strengthen your networks. All right. So simple solutions to some of the issues include providing funding and assistance for formal and informal gatherings. So if you're a funder who is listening, right, make sure that you encourage this networking and be willing to sponsor some of that informal networking, through gatherings where that networking can take place, right? And at these gatherings, you want people to get to know one another. You want them to be able to break down some of the silos that would prevent them from supporting one another. And another suggestion is to cultivate younger staff who have leadership aspirations. And in fact, it might be better to groom your own leadership rather than bring on people from the outside. One reason is you want to maintain the culture that you have. That is, if it's a positive one, if you have a culture where people are working together, they have a decent rapport with their board and as well as a decent rapport with the community, you want to maintain that. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes that can be eroded by hiring many people from the outside because they come from a different culture. All right. Now, the survey found that high levels of interest in leading among people in their 20s, right? People come into the workplace and they're all energetic and ready to go. So you want to tap into that energy, right? Because soon after they get to learn the ropes, some of that energy goes away and then people just kind of fall back, right? But you want to maintain that hunger for leadership, but you also want to balance that. You don't want to create an environment that's cutthroat where people are coming to, take the job of the person that is training them. So it's a delicate balance. All right. They found that 13% fewer respondents of color reported receiving mentoring from within their organizations than white staff. So we have a mentoring gap as well. So not only do we have a mentoring crisis where people are afraid to mentor because they don't want to end up in HR or even fired because of some conflict, right? So you got that going on. But at the same time, you got this other undercurrent where people of color are not getting the same kind of support that white people are getting. It doesn't necessarily have to be because of racism, per se, overt racism. It could be just naturally white people have more resources, they have broader networks, right? Um, so we, as Black people, as people of color, we need, again, as I was saying, to strengthen our networks and not necessarily keep our networks all of one race, right? All right, young people, they need mentors who can encourage them and show them the benefits of leading. So, as you develop your internal mentoring program, it could be formal or informal, but I would strongly suggest that you try to do something that has some structure to it. You want a structured program, but still allows flexibility for people to approach this relationship as they see fit, right? And you might also want to include some other leadership development activities and have people develop their own leadership plans. All right. I think I might have turned this off too soon. Just got one more slide. And then finally, you want to remain open to and fun alternative leadership approaches. Again, not every organization is the same, so it might require something different from each organization based on their own circumstances. One thing that's becoming more popular is this shared leadership model where you've got a co-executive director model. But I would caution you, even though that sounds nice, make sure there is clear division of duties. You don't want to create a situation where there is confrontation and conflict and competition trying to figure out who's the top dog, right? You really, really want to have an environment where that authority is shared. And it helps if you outline specific duties for one versus the other, right? So they're finding that the co executive director arrangements are on the rise. They're doubling for leaders of color, up to 12% from 6%. So this is an indication that sharing leadership is another way of supporting people in that role. All right, so at this point, I'm going to stop now and see if you have any questions, any comments. Alrighty. Oh, thank you, Sean. I will need to check that over once this is done. You're seeing only slide number one. I hope I was able to fix that. If not, I will have to do a new recording. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. I know you're not here, but thank you for joining us. And then Bevan Joseph is no longer with us. And when I say no longer with us, he's no longer on this call. But he says, I founded an NFP and led it for almost 10 years. I stepped away from the organization because it's very hard to scale an NFP, nonprofit organization. I was being asked to expand to multiple US cities and even London. I decided not to expand and just focus in Chicago. I also felt like I could have a bigger impact in the for profit social impact space. I sacrificed a lot personally and professionally to start my own nonprofit and help lots of kids, but I had to eventually maximize my earning potential and expertise. And at this point in my career, I'm assuming it seemed to have dropped off. But Bevan, thank you so much for that. That's really, really good to hear. All right. James Davis, thank you so much. You said great presentation. Thank you. I really appreciate your ongoing support. James is one of our members, and I really appreciate Bevan's insights and his comments from his own personal experience. All right. If there is anyone else watching, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the chat. When we go off, I will check again. All righty. All right. So thanks again. And you take care. Bye bye.